Hey guys, it's Greg Webster with High Speed Spanish, and welcome to today's master class, which is titled Five Steps to a More Meaningful and Secure Relationship with Your Spanish Speaking Partner by Achieving Rapid Spanish Fluency. Now, look, I know a lot of these types of things, they kind of hang around and play games at the start and spend a long time to get going. I don't want to do that. I want to respect your time and my time. So let's get right to it. So, first of all, let's talk about who this is for. This is for the partners of native Spanish speakers who want to have a stress free, meaningful, and secure future with their Spanish speaking partners by becoming fluent in Spanish on a high speed basis themselves. Whether you want to experience a greater level of intimacy with your partner by learning Spanish, or you want to feel like you're finally accepted by your Spanish speaking partner's family by learning Spanish, either way, this is for you. So, for all you spouses of native Spanish speakers, here's what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes. First, we're going to cover the various ways you may have tried to learn Spanish in the past and why those ways don't work. Next, we'll cover reasons why it's a terrible idea to have your spouse teach you Spanish. Third, we'll talk about why you're only fooling yourself if you think you're actually learning Spanish just by learning how to say certain random individual words. And lastly, we'll talk about why learning Spanish from a native Spanish speaker almost never results in people actually reaching their goal of fluency. My promise to you is to give you a step by step strategy to achieving rapid Spanish fluency and a better relationship with your Spanish speaking partner. But before we get into all that, I just want to take a moment and check in with you. Does any of the following sound like you? Have you taken several Spanish classes in the past, but still can't even hold a 5-minute conversation with anyone in Spanish today? Is it stressful and frustrating when your Spanish speaking spouse tries to teach you Spanish? Are you finding that despite having learned various Spanish words up until now, those random words aren't really helping you actually speak the language? Have you found that asking a native Spanish speaker doesn't really help you because they don't really know how to explain the specific reason why certain things are said in a certain way in the language? All they can tell you is, I don't really know why. That's just the way I've always said it. That's not helpful. Do you wish you had a roadmap that will guide you to long term fluency in Spanish and would forever remove that barrier of intimacy between you and your partner? So, the big question we're really talking about here is, do you feel like there's still a layer of intimacy with your partner that you won't truly be able to reach until you finally learn to speak Spanish once and for all? Well, one of the huge problems I hear from spouses of native Spanish speakers is that trying to learn Spanish from their spouse was a bad idea. So let's talk about this spousal dynamic and why it fails miserably when it comes to you actually learning Spanish from your spouse. First of all, during the many years I've been teaching Spanish, I've heard countless reasons from my actual students as to why they ultimately decided not to learn Spanish from their spouse. And here are just a few of those reasons. The first one is the were you even listening syndrome. So, this is when your spouse has the mindset that if you don't instantly remember a Spanish concept that they may have taught you in the past, surely you must have just been ignoring them. That leads to you not wanting to ask your spouse even the smallest question about Spanish in the future. Let me know if you can identify with this. The second reason my students tell me it's a terrible idea to learn Spanish from their spouse is the word omission nitpick. So this happens when your spouse gets frustrated with you if you leave out just one little word. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's an example. In English, we say, I made dinner. In Spanish, you have to say, I made the dinner. Okay, so in Spanish, it's yo hice la cena. The word for dinner is cena, and la is the. So if you just say yo hice cena, it doesn't sound right to the ear of a native Spanish speaker, and then they'll call you on it. But You're over here thinking, really? Just that one little word, and you're going to tell me I'm wrong? So that, as you can imagine, can be very frustrating. And that brings us to the third reason why it's a terrible idea to learn Spanish from your spouse, which is busy spouse equals no lessons in the house. So this happens when your spouse can't teach you simply because they're too busy. And that's pretty self explanatory. And the fourth reason why it's a terrible idea to learn Spanish from your spouse is not enough positive reinforcement. So this is when all your spouse does is pick apart everything you try to say in Spanish. So you're only getting negative feedback and nothing positive. That's a big one that I hear. Then there's the over explainer for number 5. So this happens when you ask for a confirmation that you used a certain word or phrase in the right way, and your spouse says, yes, that's right. And after that, you're all happy and proud of yourself and ready to move on. But then they go on to over explain things by saying stuff like, okay, but sometimes people use it like this. Or in certain circumstances, that word could also be taken as this. Or in Costa Rica, it means one thing, but in Ecuador, it means another. And then you say, oh, okay, but in the situation I specifically asked you about just now, I used it correctly, right? And then they say, yes, you did. That's right. And you're thinking to yourself, so why in the world did you even bother to tell me all that other stuff right now? Does that sound familiar? And then number 6 is the have your people call my people syndrome. Obviously, we've all heard this phrase used as a joke, mainly in Hollywood, between busy actors and their agents. But this concept can also be applied between spouses in the same household when they're trying to line up their schedules when it comes to learning Spanish with the one spouse teaching the other. So when you want to learn Spanish, your spouse doesn't have the time to teach you. And then later on, when they do have the time to teach you, you might not be in the right mindset for learning that particular Spanish concept in that specific moment in time. And then your spouse gets all offended and says that you're not really taking learning Spanish seriously. That one I've heard quite often as well. And finally, there's the it's all relative syndrome. So you get nervous practicing Spanish with your spouse because you know that they're not only judging your progress based on what they think, but also based on what their family will think. So even though I put this in last, it's actually the one I hear the most. Well, if any of that sounds like you, I have good news. None of those are the real problem. The real problem is you haven't made the shifts. And we're going to talk about exactly what those shifts are in just a moment. But for now, just know this. Once you make them, you'll no longer look at Spanish as a barrier that's coming between you and your partner, but rather as something that's fun, that you can share together forever. You'll establish a greater closeness with and acceptance by your partner's Spanish speaking family. You'll completely eliminate the stress and anxiety you used to feel at family functions because you don't speak Spanish. And if that's your goal, you'll be able to raise your kids in a truly bilingual household. Now, let's talk about exactly what a shift is. A shift is a fundamental change that you make in your thinking or approach to tackling a challenge that takes you away from what you're currently doing and starts you on a completely new and different path to achieving your goal. Listen, as a longtime instructor, I've been successful in helping my students achieve rapid Spanish fluency by taking them away from their current inadequate way of learning Spanish and bringing them towards my shifts through which they ultimately became fluent in Spanish. And there are 5 of them. So, exactly what are these shifts that you're going to need to make once and for all in order to break through those barriers to learning Spanish that you yourself have been experiencing so that you can finally establish the level of intimacy and acceptance between you, your spouse, and your spouse's family that you've always been wanting? Well, shift one is to treat your learning of Spanish as a passion, not as a hobby. So, what do I really mean by that? Well, here's what I mean. Up to now, can you honestly say that you've done everything you possibly could have done to learn Spanish? Ask yourself that. And for this, you really need to be honest with yourself. So, having this take responsibility mindset toward learning Spanish is just as important as anything else you've been doing from a practical learning standpoint up until now. You're the one who ultimately has to decide if learning Spanish is just another one of your many hobbies in life or if learning Spanish is truly a passion for you. So, how do you figure out if learning Spanish is not just a hobby for you, but rather your passion? Well, the following two scenarios will give you your answer. Scenario one: is thinking about Spanish a hobby or a passion for you? So, when you approach thinking about Spanish as a hobby, in your mind, you're content with thinking in English as you go about your day. But when you approach thinking about Spanish as a passion, you're interested in learning how to actually translate your English thoughts into Spanish in your head as you go about your day. So, which is it? Scenario two: is studying Spanish a hobby or a passion for you? So, when you approach studying Spanish as a hobby, you do it because it's something you were always curious about trying. But when you approach studying Spanish as a passion, you have an actual specific goal that you will not be able to achieve unless you learn Spanish. So, which is it? So, read the previous two scenarios multiple times and decide which person you relate to the most. And as you continue to watch this workshop, you need to decide if you're a Spanish as a hobby person or a Spanish as a passion person going forward. That said, have you been trapped in the chart memorization dead end? I call it that for a reason. Sure, those charts, and if you've ever tried to study Spanish at all in the past, you know which ones I'm talking about. Sure, those charts do contain vital information about the language. Of course they do. But if you try to memorize them, you're making a big mistake. That's because just plain memorizing those charts gets you forever locked into the wrong speech pattern for when you're trying to recall the information you're actually going to need in order to hold a real conversation with someone in Spanish. You'll never achieve the results you want that way. That's why, when it comes to those charts, in Shift 2, I'm going to teach you how to navigate those charts as opposed to memorize them. So, once I've taught you how to escape the chart memorization dead end nightmare, I'll teach you how to use my secret weapon. And that secret weapon is the word ownership blueprint. I've found that the fastest way to quickly learn Spanish is to own your words. And what's the best way to own your words? Tell your story. Shout out your own personal story to the world in Spanish. Now, right now, you don't know how to do that. I realize that. But once you can do that, and you know why you're saying the words you're saying, just imagine how much Spanish you'll know. And then from that point on, your personal story will act like a magnet, naturally drawing so many other Spanish words into your vocabulary. Look, Nobody else is going to have you jumping into saying anything that complex right away because most teachers don't think that their students can handle it. Well, guess what? With the way that I can show you, you'll learn to not only handle it, but flourish at it. Remember, as a non native Spanish speaker myself, I've already done what you're trying to do. And when I was initially preparing myself to be a teacher of the language to others, I said, okay, knowing what I know now, if I had to go back and relearn the language and avoid all the wrong methods and wastes of time and mistakes that people make in learning Spanish, how would I do it? Well, that very way is how I teach my students right now. Now, before we get into that, I just want to talk about the old way versus the new way of learning Spanish. So, the old way consisted of taking Spanish classes at the community college, learning random individual Spanish words, and learning from a native Spanish speaker. Well, these don't work, and here's why. As far as A is concerned, taking Spanish classes at the community college only leads to endless grammar memorization, like we talked about before with all the memorization of those charts and so on. That's a drag. Also, you often end up learning a bunch of words and phrases you're never going to use in real life in the first place. For example, how many of you have actually been in a Spanish class in the past where the teacher hands out a copy of some article or story that talks about some esoteric historical topic, and you've thought, okay, this is nice, but I just want to learn how to say normal stuff and ask normal questions. When do I learn how to do that? For example, I have in front of me right now a page from a book that's actually made for teachers to use in teaching their students. And the article talks about the historical significance of the gaucho in ancient Uruguay. Really? Are you ever even going to use 10% of the words or phrases in that article? No, you're not. Meanwhile, do you perhaps think that knowing how to say things like this might be slightly more practical? Hey, I just sent you an email about the party that Teresa's having this weekend. Did you get it? Okay, now how do you say that? That's the kind of stuff you want to learn how to say, not some esoteric stuff you'll never ever say in real life in the first place. And the actual practical stuff is what I'm going to teach you. Now let's look at B, learning random individual Spanish words. Spending your time doing this is never going to actually lead you to Spanish fluency. You're never going to get conversational if you just randomly learning how to say table or fork or shoe or door, etc. If you went up to somebody and said, the Spanish word for door is puerta. If you went up to somebody and said puerta, they'd come back with, yeah, what about it? It's not a full sentence. Now let's look at C. I know this might be controversial, but here's why I stand by what I said. We've talked about one of the reasons before when I talked about how they learned Spanish growing up. And when you ask them to explain a simple concept, all they can do is tell you, well, I don't know why it's like that. It's just the way I've always said it. That's one thing. Another thing is because they know everything about Spanish, they think they need to teach you everything about Spanish from day one. What always results from this is that the student gets bogged down with a bunch of rules that they don't even need to worry about in the beginning. Then they get frustrated and they quit. Does that sound familiar? If so, let me show you my new way of learning Spanish. Now, for the new way, I broke these down in terms of where you should be best focusing your time and energy learning the language. So, by using my word ownership blueprint that we talked about, you're going to spend 30% of your time learning how to speak advanced sentences about yourself from day one. In the beginning, this is really 100%, I realize, because that's all you're going to be doing, because that's all you know. I understand that. But in the overall process, from when you first start to learn Spanish to when you're truly conversational, it's only 30%. Then you're going to spend 40% of your time learning how to speak those advanced sentences about everyone else in your life, not just yourself. So once your Spanish is good enough to talk about what you yourself are doing, then you'll improve your Spanish to also include talking about what others are doing, such as they are doing this, we did this, she will do that, you are doing this, and so on. After that, you'll spend 20% of your time learning how to understand what people are saying to you. At this point, the previous two steps have dramatically expanded your vocabulary, and that expansion of your vocabulary has acted like a magnet, constantly drawing in new words over and over again. And because you now know so many words, guess what? You're going to recognize those very same words when you hear someone else speaking them to you. And finally, you'll be truly conversational. So, very plainly put, this last part is where you simply put the previous steps above together and lock in your fluency in speaking Spanish. Shift 4 is the glue that holds it all together. Your glue is to learn the equation. And that equation is strategic textbook study added with passive immersive learning, and that's going to equal you actually speaking Spanish. So, how does the equation break down exactly? Well, by strategic textbook study, I mean learning only the minimum that you need to know from textbooks and filtering out all the other nonsense that has you spinning your wheels and wasting your time on stuff that you really don't need to worry about right now. Well, I've done that filtering for you. And by passive immersive learning, I mean first figuring out what Spanish words you need to use to say what you want to say, and then going back and learning exactly why and how those words were used. And I will show you exactly how to do that. Now, all of the above is possible if and only if you take the time to find a good coach. And I'm not even saying it has to be high speed Spanish. I've met with potential students in the past who've decided to go in a different direction. I totally understand that. All I'm saying is that everyone who wants to become fluent in Spanish should have the proper mentor who fits them personally because it brings you two things. One, it brings you new ideas that you can cultivate into your own way of learning. And two, it brings accountability on yourself because you'll have someone else monitoring your progress. Anyone who's committed to any sort of personal growth, which learning Spanish definitely is, should spend their time finding their own ideal mentor because finding that person will make the previous four shifts not only happen faster, but happen faster and easier. Doing this takes all the guesswork and confusion off the table. It'll enable you to fast track your learning and eliminate all the time wasters and self doubt that you go through. Bottom line, take the time to do your research and find the best coach for you personally that's out there. Why stay stuck in boring, repetitive Spanish classes and still not be able to hold a simple 5-minute conversation? Why continue to endure the stress and frustration of not being able to speak Spanish with your spouse's family? And why not have a roadmap that will guide you to long term fluency in Spanish and will forever remove that barrier of intimacy between you and your partner? So, what did we promise to cover today? Well, we covered the various ways you may have tried to learn Spanish in the past and why those ways don't work. We covered why you're only fooling yourself if you think you're actually learning Spanish just by learning how to say random individual words, and why learning Spanish from a native Spanish speaker almost never results in people actually reaching their goal of Spanish fluency. So, just a little bit about who I am. I'm someone who has already done what you're trying to do by figuring out a way to learn Spanish on a high speed basis. Now, I can teach you exactly how I did it so you can do it too. So, what do you need to actually win at this? Well, first, you need to be honest with yourself and take responsibility for your own learning. And then you need to stop memorizing those endless grammar charts. And then you need to use the secret weapon, which is my word ownership blueprint. And then you need to learn the equation of how everything fits together in your Spanish learning process that we've previously talked about. And even if you don't do the high speed Spanish method, either way, you need to take the time and do your research and find a good coach, whoever it is. And again, it doesn't even have to be us. So now you have a choice. You can stay stuck with not truly learning the Spanish language and reaping all the benefits that come with it that deep down you know you deserve. Or if you're done with all that and you're ready to embark on a completely new path in your Spanish learning, here's what I have for you. My team and I will set aside some time to speak with you personally about how you yourself can apply these ideas to learning Spanish starting today. Remember, whatever your biggest challenges are, we've already seen them and we know how to overcome them. During this session, we'll work with you to craft a step by step game plan to have you quickly understanding and speaking Spanish so that you're no longer stuck in your Spanish learning dead end and you can finally achieve your goals, whether it be once and for all gaining the respect of your spouse's side of the family or raising your kids in a truly bilingual household. However, you envision your life as a Spanish speaker, we can get you there. And the cost, it's absolutely free. But there is a catch. And the catch is, it's not for everyone. So, here's who this is for. First, you must be completely coachable and willing to set aside all of your previous unsuccessful learning methods. Because if you don't do that, you'll stay stuck in the same place you are right now, and your ability to speak this language will never come. Also, you must be honest with yourself in the Spanish learning process and hold yourself accountable for your own success. And this goes back to what I said earlier when I asked you if you truly feel that you've been completely honest with yourself up to this point with learning Spanish. And most Spanish learners, if they're being completely honest with themselves, would admit that they could do more. So, if that's you, book your free consultation now. So, let me talk about why we're doing this. We do this because my team and I have been through all of the different ways of learning Spanish, and I've already lived the frustration of trying to learn the Spanish language via the conventional classroom method. We've seen everything, and we know why those ways don't work. And more importantly, we've figured out what does work. So, if you want help in transforming the way you learn Spanish so that you can finally become fluent in this language, contact us so we can see if it's a good fit for the both of us. If not, that's okay too. So, to book your call, go to the link below. When you click on that link, you'll be taken to our calendar and you'll see a selection of times there. I want you to pick the time that works best for you and give us a little information about your Spanish learning experience thus far so that we can prepare for our call with you. Then we'll call you at the time you told us to call you, and we'll talk about the things you need to do to become fluent in Spanish on a high speed basis. I promise you it's going to be the best time you've ever spent in figuring out exactly where to focus your energy with learning Spanish going forward. Look, you've got everything here you need to succeed. And I really hope our time here has been super motivational for you and that you've begun to see that you really are capable of attaining Spanish fluency if you do the right thing. So, when you book your call at that link, we're going to get you clear on three major things. We'll get you clear on why what you've been doing up till now to learn Spanish hasn't fully worked for you. Secondly, we'll get you clear on how your life will be transformed when you finally do become fluent in Spanish. And lastly, we'll get you clear on developing your own personal learning plan to make your goal a reality. So click on the link to book your call, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.